Hey there, everybody. Today we are talking about Chapter 2 in the PenTest book here, and this is the chapter that is about planning and scoping penetration tests. Now, just to put this in context, if you guys remember from Chapter 1, we talked a little bit about the CompTIA penetration testing process, and that had 4 steps. Planning and scoping is the first one of those steps, and the other thing that Chapter 1 covered was the cyber kill chain model. And for those of you that remember comparing these two models, the cyber kill chain is actually not something that deals with planning and scoping at all. This is something that shows up in the CompTIA way of doing pen tests, but it actually happens before anything happens in the cyber kill chain model, and that's okay. But it's still something that's pretty important to talk about, even though it only shows up in the CompTIA pen test one and not the cyber kill chain. That doesn't mean that it's not important. But planning and scoping is kind of a catch-all term to talk about everything that you're doing before you actually start conducting the tests. So this is anything that's legal considerations that you're talking about, any sort of technical considerations that you're talking about, sort of the limits of the project, what you're designed to, what you're supposed to be testing. That's covered here as well. So let's jump into some of the details here and see what we can talk about. So there's a couple different assessment types that you can have. But I think probably the first thing that we should talk about when we're talking about how you start one of these projects in general is going to be what the scope of it is. So I think you guys have probably heard me talk about scope creep in various classes before. If you haven't, we'll talk about that in another few minutes here. But one of the things that is important when you're doing any sort of project is to figure out exactly what the limits of that project are going to be. So if somebody says, well, you've got 3 days and 2 laptops and 3 technicians, and you're supposed to hack into this network, that's going to be a really different sort of test than if you have 3 dozen people working for you and all the network resources that you can get your hands on. The scope of those tests are going to be changed by the budget. So that's something to think about. What exactly is this test designed to accomplish? And depending on what the scope of it is, it's going to depend on the type of assessment that you're doing. And the book lists a couple here that are sort of the more common assessment types that you may have. First, if you have a goal-based or an objective-based assessment, that's usually done for some sort of specific. Well, it says a specific reason. What that means here is, let's say you've done some sort of network upgrade, or you've put new routers in, or you have a new web server. If you've done something new like that, then the test that you do as a result of that is going to be a goals-based or an objective-based assessment. That's not necessarily something that's designed to test everything on the network. At least in some instances, it's going to be designed to test in at least some assessments in just the thing that you put in. If you're supposed to be testing the network infrastructure, somebody's probably not going to be terribly interested in having, if say somebody could do dumpster diving to get proprietary company information. That's going to be something that's interesting to do, but it's not necessarily something that's within the scope of that test. So when we talk about goals-based assessments, we're talking about something, usually it's if you have a new design or something that hasn't been deployed to the field yet and you want to test that thing, then that's going to be a goals-based assessment. If you have something that's been replaced in an existing network, that could be tested as, and that's a goals-based assessment as well. Now, if you have something that's compliance-based assessments, those are a little bit different. That's going to be something that is required for some sort of, say, an annual inspection. So one of the things that we talked about in the last chapter was the the requirements for people that are handling credit cards and debit cards. If you are working with one of those companies and you have a compliance-based assessment, what that means is that you're required to do some sort of penetration test on some sort of regular basis. And if you're doing that test, that's a test that is going to be designed to maintain compliance with some sort of external organization or internal procedures, and those are going to be done on a regular basis. You're probably going to be testing for the same sort of stuff every time, and these may not be done after any sort of upgrade or something. They're going to be they have to be done on a periodic basis, regardless of whether or not anything has changed with the network. So that's a compliance-based assessment. The last kind of assessment the book talks about here is a red team assessment, and those are going to be a little bit different. Those are, I think, probably what we think of when we think of a penetration test. If you have a group of people that are trying to figure out how to get into the system, if they're just trying to get in some way, that's going to be a red team assessment. So one of the terms that is mentioned from time to time in penetration testing is you talk about red team and blue team sort of things here. And if you have a red team, those are generally the guys that are doing offense, and blue teams are generally playing defense. So that's where that that term comes from. One of the other things that we could talk about here is whether tests are being done as white box tests or black box tests or gray box tests. So these have to do with how much information a team is given before the test starts. And now something I want you guys to note is that if you compare this to the previous slide, there's really no sort of correlation with these types of assessments and the knowledge that any one of those start with. In other words, if something's a goals-based assessment, you can't say, well, since it's a goals-based assessment, it's a white box test. If a goals-based assessment could be white or black or gray, and I think that pretty much applies to all of the different things here. So if you have a white box, which depending on who you talk to, are sometimes called crystal boxes or clear boxes. But the implication of all of these terms is that you know everything that you could possibly want to know about the environment. If you have a white box test and you're trying to get into somebody's server, for example, into their mail server, you would be given a network diagram and any other information that you would want to have about their the way their environment is configured. So that's and you can see how if you have that information and you have a copy, say, of everybody's password policy, you'll know exactly. It should be easier under most circumstances to get into the system. It increases your probability of success. One of the other things that it does here is it sort of serves to equalize the playing field. If you are not great at penetration testing, but you're doing a white box test, still may be able to compromise the system. That's probably going to be harder to do if you're using a black box test. And a black box test, it means that you're trying to penetrate or compromise the system, and you have been given no information about that. If you're trying to get into a network, you're not given any information about what they're using, and you are only sort of permitted to use what you can find out. And as you would probably guess, a gray box is something that's sort of philosophically between the two extremes. It's not really a white box test. It's not really a black box test. There's some information that is given here, but you're not necessarily given everything that you might possibly want. Of these three tests, a black box test is probably the most similar to what you would expect to have to do if you were trying to duplicate what an actual attacker was seeing. Typically, most companies, they're not going to publicize all their internal sort of knowledge there, and so if you want to simulate what actual bad actors that are out there somewhere would be doing, the black box test is the best way to do that. Something else that's worth noting here is what the book terms the adversary tier, And this kind of this illustrates a couple things here. First of all, it gives you an idea of which of these things is most likely to be common and which of them is likely to be a larger problem. So if you read this from top to bottom, you're increasing the danger that you have with each one of these groups. At the same time, you're decreasing the probability that you're going to have to deal with them. For example, pretty much, I think any company of any size out there has had to deal with script kiddies. This is a term that we've talked about in some of our other classes, but script kiddie is somebody who is a very basic hacker. They may have access to tools that they don't necessarily understand, but that doesn't stop them from getting out on the internet and seeing what they can get into, mainly because they're bored, I think, in at least some instances. Some of them want to learn, but typically when you're looking at script kiddies, you're dealing with people that are not expert hackers. Now, there may be a large amount of them, so your probability of having to deal with script kiddies is pretty high, but they're unlikely to cause sort of persistent damage to network infrastructure or compromise large amounts of data. It's just as a general rule. Hacktivists and hacking groups, and these are groups like Anonymous, are a little bit more rare, but they generally have a little bit more knowledge. So they're going to be a larger threat, even though there are fewer of them. And you can kind of just keep going through this and see how this ends up being true. Professional black hats are going to be people that hack for a living. Organized crime, probably even less likely to run into those, but they may even have more expertise. And APTS here is what's sort of designated as advanced persistent threats. And in the context of penetration testing, I think this is probably a good example of that would be, say, the North Korean government. So the North Koreans seem like they are able to hack a lot of American companies and get into a substantial amount of trouble, or cause trouble for places like Sony, anyway. And you are not necessarily going to run into those kind of threats all the time, but they're worth being aware of. That they could be out there. And one of the things to consider is, depending on what your company does, you may run into more or fewer APTSs depending on what you're known for doing. So that's something to consider as well. One of the things that gets decided during this planning and scoping process is what are termed the rules of engagement. Now, the rules of engagement, when you're talking about a penetration test, are the way in which everything's going to be conducted. So if you were tasked with getting into somebody's server room, for example, let's say you're trying to get access to somebody's server room to steal a copy of their backup tapes for some reason. Typically, you're going to try to do something like, I don't know, shoulder surfing, or you're going to try to follow somebody in, even if you don't have a badge, or you may try to hack through something on the network. But in most instances, I think probably pulling out a gun and forcing the security guard to let you into the server room is probably not going to be something that's considered to be within the rules of engagement. There are certain things that are lines that we don't cross as penetration testers. Other elements that are going to be included here are how long is this test going to go on? What are the sort of things that you're allowed to attempt to compromise? If you were able to get copies of data from a company, well, you've probably actually got a copy of their actual data, so they don't want you to just release that out into the wild. How are you going to handle any of the data that you're able to compromise? How are you going to make sure you don't accidentally erase all their backup tapes or something like that? There's a couple other concerns here that are not denoted on the slides, but they're in the book. What sort of who are you supposed to be communicating with? Are you supposed to send daily or weekly status reports? And if something goes wrong, who do you contact? All of those things kind of are defined when we're trying to come up with the rules of of engagement. So there's a couple other things before we go on to talk about documentation. One of the things that is important to realize is that the limitations of the test are just as important as the what's specified that you're testing. So if you're able to get something in writing that says that you only are accessing a particular part of their network, well, if something goes wrong on some other part of the network, if you aren't able to explain what you did and why you're not why you stayed in the lane that you're supposed to stay in, there might be some ramifications for accidentally doing something bad elsewhere on the network. So that's something to be aware of. There's a discussion in the book. Now we're on about page 40 about sort of a deeper dive into scoping, and there's not a slide for that, but I think there's a couple things here that are probably worth talking about. One of the things that's really important is making sure that you have a list of the acceptable targets. So there's a couple concepts here that are important. First of all, if something is out of scope, it's not your job to try to compromise it in any way. As a general rule, if you compromise some data center that was say part of the same company but not what you were supposed to be checking out, unless it's related in some way, people are probably not going to be impressed, and you're not going to want to spend a lot of effort compromising things that you're not being paid to compromise, if that makes sense. But the sort of the reverse thing to keep in mind here is that there are also elements in which you may start by compromising something, and that gets you a way of accessing the system that you're actually supposed to compromise. So if you were able to compromise, say, if you're trying to get copies of, say, emails of upper management, for example, you may not be able to necessarily get into the email server right at first. You may wind up say if you're able to snoop network diagrams, and this gets you, or as network traffic, and this gets you into a router, for example, well, now you've got something that you can you might be able to jump from there to a mail server, even though that hacking the router wasn't necessarily something you were contracted to do. If you're able to do that, that's generally considered to be something that would be decided in scope, in scoping considerations. So in some instances, depending on how documentation is written and what your contract looks like, that might be permitted. In some instances, it might not be. So I think probably the last thing to talk about before we get to documentation is this idea of scope creep. One of the ways that projects can go really off the rails is if you're testing something and you're asked, oh well, as long as you're doing that, can you test this as well? And if you this is something that it gets to be a problem in a whole lot of government contracts, is that customers will frequently ask you to add features to the product because they think it's not going to be much trouble, and it winds up being frequently a lot of trouble and can cost a lot of money. And most contracting places are happy to do that if they're being paid for it. But if you are just being asked to add things to document to the test or to the product that you're doing, scope creep is something to be aware of. And if you are testing a certain sort of designated number of things and you don't clearly define that during scoping, then it could be something that is problematic later on when people say, well, I was expecting you to test these things as well. Scope creep is something that can be problematic for a whole bunch of different projects, and pen testing is definitely one of those, so be careful about that. Alright, that's it for this video. We'll come back and start talking about documentation in just a couple minutes.